on for all the forenoon. But as he thought of his father and mother, his pulse quickened and the pain in his head suddenly became intense. He could hardly walk to the van, and he found its motion insupportable. On reaching the prison he was too ill to walk without assistance across the hall to the corridor or gallery where prisoners are marshalled on their arrival. The prison warder, seeing at once that he was a clergyman, did not suppose he was shamming, as he might have done in the case of an old jail-bird. He therefore sent for the doctor. When this gentleman arrived, Ernest was declared to be suffering from an incipient attack of brain fever, and was taken away to the infirmary. Here he hovered for the next 2 months between life and death, never in full possession of his reason and often delirious. But at last, contrary to the expectation of both doctor and nurse, he began to slowly recover. It is said that those who have been nearly drowned find the return to consciousness much more painful than the loss of it had been, and so it was with my hero. As he lay helpless and feeble, it seemed to him a refinement of cruelty that he had not died once and for all during his delirium. He thought he should still most likely recover, only to sink a little later on from shame and sorrow. Nevertheless, from day to day he mended, though so slowly that he could hardly realize it to himself. One afternoon, however, about 3 weeks after he had regained consciousness, the nurse who tended him, and who had been very kind to him, made some little rallying sally which amused him. He laughed, and as he did so, she clapped her hands and told him he would be a man again. The spark of hope was kindled, and again he wished to live. Almost from that moment his thoughts began to turn less to the horrors of the past and more to the best way of meeting the future. His worst pain was on behalf of his father and mother, and how he should again face them. It still seemed to him that the best thing both for him and them would be that he should sever himself from them completely, take whatever money he could recover from Pryer, and go to some place in the uttermost parts of the earth, where he should never meet anyone who had known him at school or college, and start afresh. Or perhaps he might go to the gold fields in California or Australia, of which such wonderful accounts were then heard. There he might even make his fortune, and return as an old man many years hence, unknown to everyone, and if so, he would live at Cambridge. As he built these castles in the air, the spark of life became a flame, and he longed for health and for the freedom which, now that so much of his sentence had expired, was not after all very far distant. Then things began to shape themselves more definitely. Whatever happened, he would be a clergyman no longer. It would have been practically impossible for him to have found another curacy, even if he had been so minded. But he was not so minded. He hated the life he had been leading ever since he had begun to read for orders. He could not argue about it, but he simply loathed it and would have no more of it. As he dwelt on the prospect of becoming a layman again, however disgraced, he rejoiced at what had befallen him, and found a blessing in this very imprisonment, which had at first seemed such an unspeakable misfortune. Perhaps the shock of so great a change in his surroundings had accelerated changes in his opinions, just as the cocoons of silkworms, when sent in baskets by rail, hatch before their time through the novelty of heat and jolting. But however this may be, his belief in the stories concerning the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, and hence his faith in all the other Christian miracles, had dropped off him once and forever. The investigation he had made in consequence of Mr. Shaw's rebuke, hurried though it was, had left a deep impression upon him, and now he was well enough to read, he made the New Testament his chief study. going through it in the spirit which Mr. Shaw had desired of him, that is to say, as one who wished neither to believe nor disbelieve, but cared only about finding out whether he ought to believe or no. The more he read in this spirit, the more the balance seemed to lie in favour of unbelief, till in the end all further doubt became impossible, and he saw plainly enough that, whatever else might be true, the story that Christ had died, come to life again, and been carried from the earth through clouds into the heavens, could not now be accepted by unbiased people. It was well he had found it out so soon. In one way or another it was sure to meet him sooner or later. He would probably have seen it years ago if he had not been hoodwinked by people who were paid for hoodwinking him. What should he have done, he asked himself, if he had not made his present discovery till years later, when he was more deeply committed to the life of a clergyman? Should he have had the courage to face it, or would he not more probably have evolved some excellent reason for continuing to think as he had thought hitherto? Should he have had the courage to break away even from his present curacy? He thought not, and knew not whether to be more thankful for having been shown his error, or for having been caught up and twisted round so that he could hardly err farther, almost at that very moment of his having discovered it. The price he had had to pay for this boon was light compared with the boon itself. What is too heavy a price to pay for having duty made at once clear and easy of fulfilment instead of very difficult? He was sorry for his father and mother, and he was sorry for Miss Maitland, but he was no longer sorry for himself. It puzzled him, however, that he should not have known how much he had hated being a clergyman till now. He knew that he did not particularly like it, but if anyone had asked him whether he actually hated it, he would have answered no. I suppose people almost always want something external to themselves to reveal to them their own likes and dislikes. Our most assured likings have for the most part been arrived at neither by introspection nor by any process of conscious reasoning, but by the bounding forth of the heart to welcome the gospel proclaimed to it by another. We hear some say that such and such a thing is thus or thus, and in a moment the train that has been laid within us, but whose presence we knew not, flashes into consciousness and perception. Only a year ago he had bounded forth to welcome Mr. Hawke's sermon. Since then he had bounded after a college of spiritual pathology. Now he was in full cry after rationalism, pure and simple. How could he be sure that his present state of mind would be more lasting than his previous ones? He could not be certain, but he felt as though he were now on firmer ground than he had ever been before, and no matter how fleeting his present opinions might prove to be, he could not but act according to them till he saw reason to change them. How impossible, he reflected, it would have been for him to do this if he had remained surrounded by people like his father and mother, or Prior and Prior's friends, and his rector. He had been observing, reflecting, and assimilating all these months with no more consciousness of mental growth than a schoolboy has of the growth of his body. But should he have been able to admit his growth to himself, and to act up to his increased strength, if he had remained in constant close connection with people who assured him solemnly that he was under a hallucination? The combination against him was greater than his unaided strength could have broken through, and he felt doubtful how far any shock less severe than the one from which he was suffering would have sufficed to free him. End of chapter 64. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.